Many of the ideas and concepts and theories which populate the study of knowledge, particularly within things like education, epistemology, philosophy of knowledge, also the philosophy of being and phenomenology. These disciplines often configure knowledge as existing across a continuum of having different types, the different types of knowledge, with different applications, different contexts in which they might work, different values according to context and according to content. And quite often these differences are configured very simply as a binary, two different types of knowledge. So, for example, we talk about objective knowledge and we talk about subjective knowledge. We might not use the term knowledge when we talk about subjectivity. But nevertheless, I think there is a sense in which we understand what that means. This division of knowing or knowledge into a binary, this division of knowledge into this kind of binary, objective and subjective, simultaneously divides this knowing across space, in which one part of knowledge, objective in that example, is placed at some distance, at some remove from one's self and one's body, and subjective knowledge in that case is placed very close to the self, very close to the body, possibly even inside the body, and possibly even partly constitutive of being. So there's no separation there between knowing and being in an extremely subjective case. Other examples of that spatialization, in which one type of knowledge is placed at one end of an extended space and another type of knowledge is placed at the other end. You can find that in Polanyi's distinction between implicit and explicit, tacit and explicit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is sort of out there, and it can be articulated and objectively framed and easily taught, I guess, or at least conveyed and transferred relatively unproblematically in the way that one might transfer an object from one hand to another. The up-close and personal knowledge in Polanyi, the tacit knowledge, the implicit knowledge, is not propositional in that way. It can't be framed and articulated in quite the same way, Polanyi would say, because it's embodied in a way which is part of our subjectivity, part of our being rather than part of our knowing. And I think the phrase that Polanyi uses is that we know more than we can say, and we can't say it because it is part of the act of saying, if you like. It's part of the thing that does the saying, so we can't be self-reflexive in to quite that extent. So again, you have this idea of a sort of binary distinction between two types of knowledge, one of which is objective and one of which is subjective, or one of which approaches the condition of the object and one of which approaches the condition of the subject. You also find that in, what's the guy's name? I'll come back to his name. The chap who gave a presentation at a conference in Strathclyde a couple of years ago, which I've spoken about before, I think, actually. And he talks about possessive knowledge, performative knowledge, and proactive knowledge. Possessive knowledge being the equivalent of Polanyi's explicit. It's objective, it's out there in the world. One can grasp it, it has that object knowledge status. And at the other extreme, in Donald something, the knowledge is lost to me right now. And the other extreme of the example I'm clutching for now is proactive knowledge, which is, again, very up close and personal, and possibly inarticulable, approaching not just the condition of the subject, but the condition of the drive. He talks about it being dispositional. Some people are naturally problem finders, I think he says, in which that knowledge is not so much an object outside of the self, outside of the body, but is part of the self at the level of the disposition, at the level of the drive. Again, an extreme example. One of the things that we also find, I think, in that binary between knowledge as object, external to the body, and knowledge as subject, sort of inside the body and closely alloyed to the self, is this switch from a different linguistic understanding of knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge as an object, we tend to use nouns and tend to use visual metaphors to describe that object. So if it's something we can see, and if it's close enough, it's something we can grasp and possess. But as this idea of knowledge, as our conceptualization of knowledge becomes closer to the body, it becomes more internal, it drops that noun quality and becomes much more of a verb. It becomes much more to do with knowing rather than knowledge, being rather than knowing possibly, and it has a more active, proactive quality rather than a passive object quality. In some senses, I think that directionality, that continuum of knowledge between the internal and subjective and the external and objective also kind of maps onto the direction of intentionality. The closer we place our concept of knowledge to at the destination for intentionality, the more objective we consider it, and the closer to the source of that intentionality we understand it, the more subjective we consider it to be. Because it's certainly in terms of a kind of naive understanding of psychology, a subject is defined by its presence here at this end of the gaze, and objects, however we view them, are kind of defined by their existence over there, at that end of my intentional gaze.